Yes, it was. In many ways, a very long and a very awkward week. It all started on Easter Sunday. At the end of the day, when Jesus, the risen Jesus, had come and appeared in bodily form to his disciples. He had shown them his hands and the holes in his hands. He had shown them his side and the hole that was there. And he had even breathed upon them and given to them the gift of the Holy Spirit. It was an amazing experience, the kind of experience you never forget, the kind of experience that absolutely changes your life once and for all. It's just one problem. One of them wasn't there. Thomas just wasn't around when it all happened. I suspect he was probably sent out to Timmy's to get a dozen double-doubles for the group and, a box of Timbits, because Simon Peter was, well, he really liked the sugar. But anyways, for whatever reason, he was gone. He wasn't there. And the experience was short. Probably only a few minutes. Then it was done. And when Thomas came back, they told him all about it. They shared their experience with him, but it really was one of those you had to be there moments. And so Thomas struggled with that. He had a hard time believing that what they were saying could be true. And really, who could blame him? I mean, it was a pretty fantastic story. Who can blame him for struggling to accept their experience as true and legitimate? But if he had just left it there, if he just said, guys, I can't accept this, I wasn't there, maybe that would have been all right. But Thomas wasn't like that. No, he had to go on and on and on about it all week long. Said to them, you believe that Jesus was here on Sunday? Well, let me tell you, I got some swampland in Florida that I'd love to sell. And then there was a thing where he kept on coming up alongside them and saying, hey, is that Jesus over there? And then laughing at them when they looked. His favorite one, the one that he said all the time was, when I can put my fingers in the holes in his hands and when I can put my hand in the hole in his side, then I'll believe you. But until then, I'm sorry. So all in all, you gotta admit it was a pretty long and awkward week. A week when the key characters in the Christian church were deeply divided, disagreeing about one very significant point. And it wasn't just for a moment, it went on all week. I think we often tend to look at the early church, the church that existed in those years immediately after Easter, through rose-colored glasses. We see it as a time when everything just went so smoothly, when they were all in perfect accord, when they agreed about everything. But that's not really a good and accurate picture of the early church. There was disagreement, there was dissension. Right here, in the Gospel of John, we have an account of a basic disagreement between the members of the church about something absolutely essential. And it was a disagreement. That wasn't just for a moment, that went on all week. Now I know when we look at the church today, we rarely look at it through rose-colored glasses. We tend to see all of the flaws and all the dissensions and all the disagreements. And we think we're different. But we're not. Right from the beginning, there has been this tendency for Christians, well-meaning, well-intentioned, disagreeing with one another on key points. And I think in many ways that the stories that have come down to us from the Bible of those times when the church was in disagreement are there to teach us, to help us to understand how we can do that, how we can disagree, and yet still continue to be sisters and brothers in the name of Jesus Christ. So let's look at the story. You know, in many ways, there is no reason why Thomas and the other disciples should be in disagreement. Because you know what? They share so much in common. They are all men of good faith. They have all been faithful disciples of Jesus. They have been with him from the very beginning. Thomas is no different. If anything, he is smarter and wiser and braver than the rest of them. And they've all received exactly the same instruction. They have been instructed in the way of Jesus. Probably better than anyone has ever been since, because they were there. And they heard all the parables, and they absorbed all the sayings, and they watched the miracles and the healings and everything that Jesus had done. They were part of it. And what's more, they were all sent out, 2 by 2, to preach the message of Jesus throughout all the towns and villages of Galilee. They had represented that message to the world, and Thomas had been there for all of it. He had been part of it all. So in so many ways, Thomas and the others are the same. There's nothing that should alienate them from one another. Except for one thing. Except for experience. The only real difference is that Thomas and the other disciples have had one different experience. A brief experience, a matter of a few minutes, but obviously a very significant and meaningful different experience. And Thomas recognizes that. He knows that that is the one thing that sets him apart from the others, because that's what he keeps talking about. That's what he keeps harping on. He did not experience what they did. If he did experience what they did, he said, he'd be fine. But what can he do about that? Because he cannot force himself to experience something he didn't experience. The thing that sets him apart is experience. The only thing. And you know what? I think that's often what happens in the life of the church. We disagree in the church. But honestly, when you listen to people and what they really talk about, we don't necessarily disagree about theology or Bible or interpretation or application of the Bible. Not really. Oh yes, I know we often accuse one another of being wrong, theologically or biblically or something like that. But if you listen to people, if you really listen to what they're talking about, what they're actually talking about is experience. They are speaking to one another out of very different experiences, and that's what tends to be the real root cause of the difference. For example, in the churches I've known and the churches I've seen and observed, what's one of those areas where division and dissension often occurs? It often occurs in the area of music and in the area of worship. And you have, say, one group in a congregation who loves one style and approach to music and finds that meaningful and faithful, and you have another group over here who has a different taste in music, and the two groups clash with each other and disagree, and sometimes reject the musical styles of the other. I've seen that happen again and again and again in churches. And if you listen to them and how they talk about it, they often talk about it on the level of theory. They talk about one style or approach of music being maybe more faithful to the Bible or better theologically, or they talk about musical theory or history. They argue on that level, but if you listen to them, if you really listen to the cause of the difference, chances are what they're really speaking out of is experience. Because they talk about their emotions, their feelings, how different pieces of music have touched them and ministered to them at key moments of their life, especially when they were in They stand where they stand on music because of their experience. Yes, they'll maybe rationalize that in terms of theology or whatever. But it starts with experience. And if we can't talk about that experience because it's legitimate, that experience, it's important and meaningful, how are we going to get anywhere? Another issue on which we see many churches, many denominations finding division and dissension these days is on the whole discussion around sexual orientation and gender identity and all of those somewhat difficult, thorny issues. And there is disagreement and there is dissension on those issues. And I know that people have very different positions on this, about what's acceptable, what's not, about where we need to go on these things. There is disagreement within congregations, within denominations. But it's important to see how this discussion is often couched, because it's often couched in terms of that theory, in terms of that theology and the question of being faithful to the Bible and how you interpret the Bible. But if you listen to people and why they stand where they stand and how they got to where they are, it's usually not those things that got them to where they are. If you listen to people and what they really talk about, what they talk about is feelings. About what makes them feel comfortable and what makes them feel uncomfortable. And they especially talk about their experience, about people they have known who maybe for whatever reason don't fit into traditional categories of sexuality or gender or whatever. And maybe they've had good experiences of those people, or maybe it's been bad experiences. But those experiences are what really matters. What makes them stand where they stand. And so while we do need to no doubt talk about it on the level of theology and theory and Bible and interpretation, I really believe that if we're going to get anywhere, if we're going to be able to move forward, even while we do not see some of these things in the same way, and we do need to move forward, even though we don't see things exactly the same. We need to talk about our experience and our feelings and how we got where we are. Those things matter, and they need to be addressed, and we need to open ourselves up to talk about those things. Experience matters more often than all the rest. The church will disagree over important matters. Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's worship, sometimes it's sexuality. Could be all kinds of things. Division, dissension, disagreement will happen. It happened in the early church. It happens today. But the test of Christianity, the test of the church and true faith is how do we handle that? And maybe especially how do we deal with the Thomases among us, those who do not see things, who do not agree with the majority view. How do we include them in our life in a positive and engaging way? I think the most beautiful thing about that story in the book of John, the Gospel of John, during that week is this. They kept Thomas around. They did not kick him out. He was a doubter. He was a skeptic. He openly mocked their faith and their beliefs and their experiences because he didn't have them. It must have been a pain. It must have been extremely annoying. But they kept him around. They not only tolerated him, but they loved him for who he was and accepted him as a fellow disciple and apostle of Jesus Christ. And because they loved him as he was, you know what? He was still there. He was still there the next Sunday. And because he was still there, it opened up not only him, but the whole church to another even deeper experience of the resurrection. Because when Jesus showed up as the church gathered for worship the next Sunday, Jesus did something amazing. And he took the mocking and the bad jokes of Thomas and turned them into an invitation. to take his finger and put it in the holes in Jesus' hand and put his hand in Jesus' side. It brought them all into a deeper experience of the reality and the truth of the resurrection that would not have happened if the doubter, the skeptic, the mocker had not still been among them. I believe that one of the highest callings that the church has to deal with today is this: how can we be that church between Easter Sunday and the next Sunday? How can we be that church that disagrees? How can we be that church who has among us a Thomas or two or several, who do not see things as the majority sees it, who do not see things as the tradition has seen it? Because you know what? I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are all kinds of Thomases in our churches. All kinds of people who struggle, who sometimes even openly reject traditional ideas, traditional values, biblical interpretation, you name it. We've got them. All kinds of them. For example, I would say there's huge numbers of people in our churches who simply cannot live anymore with the traditional picture of God that has been handed down to us from the Jewish and Christian tradition, that God up there looking down upon us from a distant heaven. And they're working on other ways of imagining and talking about God, a God who is present in the whole universe, and yet also bigger than the whole. We got our Thomases. They're all around us. But they're here. That's the amazing thing. They, like Thomas that week, because it was difficult for him too, they're sticking it out. They're still here, not because they have all the answers, not because they have banished all doubt, but because they recognize that despite its faults and its shortcomings, and the church has many, it still has a place and a role in God's plan for this world. And they need to be part of that. And in many ways, they are the best of our workers, most dedicated to that ministry and outreach. The presence of Thomases among us doesn't make us weak. I honestly believe it makes us stronger, much stronger. And they push us, they prod us to think of things in new terms. They push us to look past the different interpretations and theories and theologies to what we're called to do and to be in this world. Thomas and the other disciples, they disagreed. They disagreed fundamentally for one whole week. And I'm sure it was not easy. We're not told what happened behind those closed and locked doors of that upper room in Jerusalem. But it was hardly harmonious. They disagreed probably about everything, including what to have for lunch. But they stuck it out. They not only tolerated Thomas, they loved him and included him, and because of that, they opened themselves up to experience something wonderful. And as we, as the church today, continue to gather together, despite our differences, despite those who see things differently from us, we are positioning ourselves for the very same thing. That is the wonderful promise. That is the church. Would you take a few moments now in silent reflection?